Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel, and we are carrying on with the Casey Anthony trial, and the next defence witness is Dr. Werner Spitz. He's a medical doctor and a forensic pathologist. Now this testimony is 2 hours long and this guy is fairly old. I mean, he's been in medicine since 1946. So it takes him a while to go through his history, his qualifications, his work history, everything. I mean, it takes a while. And of course, it's my favourite lawyer, Mr. Mason. So after they've gone through all that, we move on to when he became involved in this case, and he thinks he received a telephone call from the Jose Baez law firm and was asked if he would consult with them on this case. He was then asked if he could attend the post-mortem examination because at the time it hadn't been performed yet. He requested to attend the post-mortem with Dr. Jan Garavaglia, but he was denied, as we'd heard in Jan's previous testimony. He says it would have been useful for him to see the body at that time, so he didn't have the same exposure to the body as others did. Excuse me. He also says it would have been really beneficial for him to be there with Jan, as he says 4 eyes are better than 2 and they could have discussed things and worked things out. He says it's customary for pathologists to involve other pathologists to see what their opinions are. I mean, you can kind of see that. Werner did conduct a second autopsy, and when the initial autopsy was concluded, he was given access to the remains. His first observations were that the first autopsy had not been completely done. And he says an examination of the interior of the skull should have been done, and it wasn't. It had not been opened, which Werner obviously did in his autopsy. So Dr. Werner now has a skull of his own to demonstrate. He says it is a real human skull. He now shows and explains what happens when you open up the skull. So now they are showing photographs of Kaylee's skull, which obviously they're not showing for us that are viewing. The dust that remains in the skull, Werner says it's when after the brain has decomposed, all the elements like magnesium and phosphate, etc., are all, deteriorate into dust. And he says the skull was found left side down when decomposing. Don't worry, he explains it more, and then the state comes in, and it does get interesting. The duct tape was not there when he got the remains, but he saw pictures. There was nothing on the skull to suggest duct tape had been on there, and there was nothing on the duct tape to suggest it had been on the skin. So he has difficulty identifying when this duct tape was placed. He would have expected that DNA would have been found on the duct tape because there is firm contact between the skin and the tape. He believes the duct tape, wait for this, he believes the duct tape was placed after decomposition. Now it comes out later why he thinks this. So now he is asked to describe what adipocere is, and he says it's a stage in decomposition where the tissue becomes broken down. He says it's slimy and it's smelly, and he says the texture is it's soapy. So under optimal conditions of a warm environment, adipocere will develop within 10 to 12 days. He found no presence of this. As for the cause of death, he says you can rule out things, but you cannot definitively say how she died. He cannot rule out accidental death. Werner cannot say what the manner of death is, so there we go with his opinion. So now we move on to the cross-examination. So Mr. Ashton is questioning Werner about the manner of death, and he's saying that all the circumstances and information need to be considered when coming to the conclusion of the manner of death, which Werner agrees with. Mr. Ashton then asks him about what he knew about all the circumstances of this case and what information he had. Werner tells him that he had police reports, he visited the Anthony home and spoke to the Anthonys themselves. He spoke to buyers, and he knows that Kaylee had been missing for a month before it was reported. Although Werner is having trouble recalling the exact name and reports he has seen, he does have a lot of trouble remembering things, to be honest. I mean, he's old, but, his intellect isn't in question, but he does struggle to hear and recall information. And I think Mr. Ashton is trying to hone in on this and bring that more to the forefront. Werner says he saw a pool at the house, which brings up the possibility of drowning. And again, he knows that Kayla was missing a month before she was reported missing. Other than that, he can't remember anything else other than what he said previously during the direct examination. Werner thinks that not opening the skull during the autopsy is a major failure. I mean, I'm not a specialist in this, so he says it's something that all pathologists do. There is something he says there's something published about it, but he doesn't know where or what it's called. So Mr. Ashton is trying to find anything and everything to prove that there is nothing written where it says that you have to open the skull in skeletal autopsies. They find nothing. So Mr. Ashton points out that there is nothing written anywhere that this has to be done, so it's just Werner that says it should be done this way. Werner has given an interview about this case to a local station in Orlando. I mean, this never ever looks good. Then someone from a paper in Detroit. It is also brought to light that he's also spoken to a female reporter from Detroit about this case. He was also on the Today Show in 2009 and 48 Hours, but he doesn't remember. Werner was also involved in the Phil Spector case and the O.J. Simpson case. He is asked if when he opened the skull, did he break it, as there is a break in the skull, which Werner now sees but doesn't remember. Werner did not do any chemical tests. What he did was take scrapings and kept them for possible testing. He says he was then told it was tested by, and then he doesn't know who. But then it found its way to the police and they tested it. I mean, but he doesn't know who told him that it had got to the police and it had been tested. He's saying that the dust that was found in the skull is brain residue from decomposition and not dirt, even though he didn't test it. And he is sticking to that statement. And basically saying he didn't need to test it because of his vast years of experience. Take that as you will, I don't. Okay, so Mr. Ashton brings up that Dr. Val Garavaglia did a saline swish of the skull through the hole underneath the skull, and he says that could be why there was only sediment left on the left side of the skull. Because remember, Werner said that the head was laid on the left side when decomposing. So Mr. Ashton says possibly because of this swish that the residue was left on the left side. Werner points out that this isn't the case because the brain residue is sticky. As for the testing of the residue, Werner says that one of the advantages of doing the autopsy with other pathologists is because they can work together and would have got the residue tested. He says he had no one to give it to. Hi everyone, sorry about that. So, as I was saying, he was saying that if he'd have been allowed in the autopsy, you know, they could have worked together and got the residue tested. But he had no one to give it to. If he would have been allowed to attend the initial autopsy, none of this would have been discussed. He doesn't have a lab to do such testing. So Mr. Ashton is trying to understand how, if the head was lying on the left side, why was the hair mat at the back of the skull? Werner says it is possible that water possibly placed it there, but as Mr. Ashton says, so the water displaced the hair but not the brain residue. Again, it is in his opinion that the duct tape was placed after decomposition. Mr. Ashton asks him how this would have been done. He says a person came and did it. I mean, this is when this guy just sounds absolutely bonkers. I mean, it makes no sense. And he says this person could have picked up the skull and stuck the tape on the skull in a way that it stuck the mandible there. So, bearing in mind, this person that picked up the skull to stick on the tape would have had to put it back together in its anatomical position. So the camera keeps flashing between Werner and Casey, and because the photographs are being shown, Casey cannot look. She keeps looking away and crying, and Mr. Ashton then points out that for this to happen, surely the duct tape would have had to have been applied on both sides. Because bearing in mind, there were three pieces of duct tape found. Mr. Ashton then asks why there was no glue residue on the skull. There's no clear answer really, and he says possibly the water. Then he comes up with a new theory. That is, this person took the skull with them, put the tape on, and then brought it back. I mean, what? It is then pointed out that why was the hair stuck to the skull as well? So now they are showing a picture of the skull with some strands of hair that are on top of the skull, and Mr. Ashton asks how it's possible that if the skull had been removed, why is there hair on top of the skull? So Werner basically says that the medical examiner purposefully put this hair on top of the skull for the photograph. I mean, so then Werner is then shown a picture of the skull at the scene where it shows strands of hair over the skull, but Werner says that this picture is not the same as the one before. I've no words, no words. So, redirect. He says another reason for opening up the skull during an autopsy is because sometimes fractures can only show up on the inside and not the outside. So, you know, when you're doing an autopsy and you look at the skull, you might not see any fractures or breaks until you actually open up the skull, and then it shows fractures inside. So, I mean, it just went totally bonkers towards the end there. I don't know. So I will be back with more in the next video. Until then, bye for now.